Okay, it is November 6th. I'm walking through a field right now. It's a beautiful autumn day. Kind of had a lackluster summer, but the autumn has more than made up for it. We've had lots of really nice bright days. Still some leaves on the trees as I'm walking. Seeing a lot of sycamores that still have just a few bits of leaves here and there. Obviously a lot more on the ground, and I'm passing some beach right now as well. And the beach, still some bits of nice bright leaves. So it's getting into late autumn now as we approach winter, and it's definitely starting to get dark by around 4 p.m. now, and then pitch black by about 5, which isn't as short as the days we'll get in Scotland. By deepest, darkest winter, it really starts to get dark by around 2:30, and by 4 it's pretty much pitch black. But for right now, we still have nice days, and we've been lucky because it's sunny. And I'm walking through a bit of a stubble field. It's just a really nice day out. Very moderate temperatures. I'm doing this in just a jumper, and that's fine. And the American election just happened, and I don't want to get too much into politics. And I think in some ways it was surprising, in some ways it wasn't surprising. And I'm probably going to spend the next few weeks thinking about what it all means. But I will say, I think it's probably a good opportunity for people who find national and international elections challenging to kind of focus on the community around you and think about what your opportunities are to build up the community around you. Think about things like mutual aid, helping each other out, creating cross connections, making face-to-face events, because I think that is probably important, and we need to think about what we have power over, what we don't have power over, and also think about what's most important. I think now, and probably has always been true, but certainly true in the upcoming decades, I think we really need to focus on building up local communities and sort of focusing on resiliency. So, great opportunity to invite some neighbors over, maybe plan some sort of event. We have another bike-free day coming up over where we live, and that's always nice because all the kids get to come out. And I said bike-free, I meant car-free. So we get the car-free day where the kids get to ride around and not have to worry about cars, and that's really nice, and good opportunity to maybe plan a shared meal or something and just really get a sense of what everyone's doing, what everyone's feeling. And I think it's probably healthier to focus on the positive things than focus on the negative. And I mean that as well in terms of the people around us. I think one of the things about the internet is very good at sorting people by what they dislike. But then I find that when I'm talking to people face to face, it's very easy to find common ground, regardless of what disagreements I might have about this political issue or the other. Sort of if you're working together in person to solve a problem, it's much easier just to get along with people and focus on what you have in common. And I don't think that's insignificant. I did some longer sort of monologues on the world and how I feel about everything, but then I realized I was getting on to about 20 minutes, and that's a bit dull for a podcast. So maybe I'll turn that into another episode one day, talking to someone else about what they think about everything. But for today, I recorded today's interview a few weeks ago, and it's with Dan Edwards at Parkour Generations. And Dan is, I guess I'd call him second generation parkour practitioner, in that he wasn't part of the original French group that developed parkour, in the outskirts of Paris, but he was one of the first foreigners. He's a British guy. He's one of the first British people to go over and study with them, and he started Parkour Generations about 20 years ago, about 2005 or so. He's really emerged, I think, as one of the most interesting and thoughtful voices in the space. He keeps a great blog, which is something I always read regularly, and I feel like he's just a very good synthesist. I feel like he's very good at taking lots of different ideas from different sources and putting them together. And I think he's someone who's really worth listening to. We had a really good conversation. You'll be able to hear that Dan is obviously a very bright guy and very thoughtful. He has a background in philosophy, amongst other things. So he's able to pull interesting references, and he's got a great perspective on things. And the beginning of the conversation, we were talking a little bit about my back injury and sort of different ways to think about training. He uh, is also a big proponent of finding your why, really interrogating why you're doing something and what your goals are, and thinking about whether or not your actions are aligned with that. So we did talk a lot about training. We talked about the emergence of parkour, what parkour is, what parkour isn't. I posed the question if parkour has an image problem, meaning is there something about the way people perceive parkour that is preventing it from becoming more mainstream? And I thought he had a very good response to that. After that, we talked a little bit about the fitness industry, and maybe some of the shortcomings of the fitness industry as it is now, and if there's some potential for it to get better. But he also did a good job of talking about the benefits of the fitness industry. I think he spoke very candidly about that. We talked about training methodologies, so a little conversation about ecological dynamics and different teaching models. He's got a teaching background, and you can really see it in the way he teaches and thinks about things. And he compared it to some of the more, I guess, traditional cognitive models when we're talking about skill acquisition. I thought he had some really good points there, some of which I hadn't considered. So I really enjoyed that. And then finally, we finished up by talking about community building and sort of finding your own community, the importance of training face-to-face in person as opposed to just relying on online training. And Dan is someone who's always traveled when he's wanted to learn. So when he wanted to learn martial arts, he moved to Japan. When he wanted to learn parkour, he moved to France. And he puts a lot of importance on that, and I think that's a very good point. So just for me, it was a really enjoyable episode. I feel like I learned a lot, and I feel like the conversation helped me crystallize a lot of what I've been thinking. So I hope you enjoy it, and let me know what you think.
How to stand on shifting sand. How to bend but stay intact.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I was thinking about deadlifting and squatting and everything, and why I still do it. And I suspect it's because that's my background and it's sort of comforting for me. But my life has never been any better if I've had a double body weight, deadlift or whatever, or a 200 kg deadlift. And I think it's one of those old holdovers I have from when I first started training, doing powerlifting and CrossFit and things like that.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I think it's just more habitual than anything. I don't know if I actually even believe there are advantages to that style of training anymore.
It's a very interesting one, isn't it? Because yeah, I think you're right. I think a lot of it is psychological, that element, in terms of a lot of people. If you start doing that and you're taught that first in terms of strength and conditioning, and that this is the science of strength training, then it becomes familiar, and it's just, we just tend to go back to those things because we know how to do it, we're good at it, it's easy, we don't need to think about it, it's automated, and also you're told this is good stuff to do, and it is going to make you stronger, obviously. So but you're absolutely right in terms of the question I would always ask is, what's it for?
Exactly.
Why are you doing deadlifts? Why are you doing squats? And someone may have a good answer. They may say, well, I'm doing deadlifts because X, Y, and Z, I compete in this, and this, and I need to have maximal strength in this area. And you're like, okay, well, fair enough, keep doing the deadlift. But if not, if there isn't a really clear answer, if it's just like, oh, I've just been told to do it, then it's like, well, maybe you don't need to do it, because I've never, my experience is the most capable athletes that I know do not do any that kind of training.
Yeah, and I think it's often putting the cart before the horse. I think people have sometimes seen that people who are very impressive athletes, if they step up to a bar, not naturally, but as a result of their training, their lifestyle, have an impressive deadlift. So I think sometimes people try to recreate it and they confuse the chicken for the egg.
Yes.
Where I find people who are sort of athletic, especially people with parkour backgrounds, will quite often, be able to express high levels of strength and power if you give them a barbell. And I think we've always assumed that there's this sort of transference from barbells to athleticism. And I'm sure there's correlations, but I think a lot of times it just reflects the biases of the strength and conditioning coaches, who come from quite often, traditionally in America, a American football background. And that's just sort of how it's been done. And I think a lot of that has also happened with Olympic lifting as well, where, there's been this sort of mystique, or at least there was when I was a CrossFit coach, 10 years ago, around Olympic lifting and having this amazing transference. But, sometimes I think we fall in love with the specificity of that style of training, and we like to see the numbers go up and everything, but it doesn't always actually, have that carryover.
No, and well, it depends. Again, it completely depends on what your purpose, why you're doing it, what the purpose is.
Exactly.
If it's your practice
Hmm.
and weightlifting and Olympic lifting, powerlifting, whichever form of lifting it is, if that is your practice, and the path you've chosen is that path, and therefore the rules of walking that path are
Yes.
to observe your numbers and increase the numbers, then great. It's as arbitrary as any other practice in that way. It's like, well, it's as arbitrary as picking golf, or
Yes.
so like there's nothing wrong with that. But if you're doing it because you think it's going to make you, a better mover and more athletic and then I would question that and say, well, probably you just need to move more to be a better mover.
Yes.
And that stuff is not going to have a huge carryover into movement. Like, it's not that it'll have no, as you say, it's not that it'll have no carryover. It will have some. It will increase your strength in certain ways, but it's very much it's a small percentage. It's like a 5%, impact on your movement. The
Yeah.
95% impact on your movement comes from movement. That's very clear to me now that I've been in movement my whole life. It's very, very clear that the movement athletes are people who move for
Yes.
95% of their training, and the non-movement, the athletes that aren't good at movement are the ones that focus on that type of training more.
Well, that's what I was going to say, is I think that people are attracted to certain things, and I think people like the comfort of the quantification of seeing the numbers go up, seeing their volume go up, whatever. It's very nice because you can point to something, especially if you haven't had much success with, qualitative movement in the past. And for me, growing up, I was never a great mover. I was never bad, but my brother was always a really, I think, just talented mover. So I think I just um, I found myself drawn to other modalities and other sports that didn't really require that. So I think, again, yeah, you see that bias in people who maybe naturally aren't great movers anyway. They like having access to the gym because it lets them sort of feel athletic, and it lets them be good at something. And for me, it just meant I just had to show up consistently and the numbers would go up.
Mm.
But then if I was honest with myself, if I went to go, say, play a game of ultimate frisbee, or if I wanted to go do something that involved running and jumping and really expressions of athleticism, again, I can't say that I never saw much carryover. And, I felt physically capable, but it never improved my jumping or my movement quality or my ability to solve problems through movement. So that was a bit of a segue. I'll do a longer intro, but who am I talking to right now?
It's a deep philosophical question to begin with. Well, I'm Dan, and I'm director of Parkour Generations. I suppose is how I'm known most. But I suppose that's just one facet of a personality. But yes, I have taught and practiced parkour and practical movement disciplines, and fighting arts and related skills for my whole life, I suppose, since I was about 8 years old in one form or another. So yeah, that's what I've done professionally for the last 20 years or so.
Yeah.
Um,
Um, yeah, I've been following you for a long time and your work at Parkour Generations, and I finally met you face to face earlier in the year, and I sort of admitted that I was a bit of a groupie, and that I've really enjoyed uh, your blog writing for a long time. The reason I wanted to get you on is I just think you've consistently been a very thoughtful and articulate voice in the parkour sphere. And that being said, I think it's a practice that attracts some very philosophical and bright people.
for sure.
I'm always impressed with that, but I think that I feel like you've always been ahead of the curve. There's two thinkers. I won't say who the other one is, but there's two thinkers that I really appreciate and admire in terms of whenever I read something, I always feel like you're really ahead of the curve on articulating that, or maybe maybe I think you're quite good at synthesizing and pulling from other practices, other ideas, other philosophies. So it's that's the last nice thing I'll say to you. But
Good, good. Yeah,
I don't want your head to get too big, but just so you know why you're on here. So yeah, you've been in the parkour game for a long time, and you've done a very good job of popularizing it, bringing it to people. And another deep philosophical question, I guess I'll follow up with is what is parkour? If for some reason someone is listening to this, what's a meaningful definition of parkour for you?
That's a great question. Those are two different questions. What is parkour,
Ooh,
and what's a meaningful definition of
yeah.
parkour to me? And it's an interesting question because we were in some ways we were the first ones who had to define it for the outside world, because we
Hmm.
were the ones asked by the government, by the UK government and Sport England, to give a formal definition so that we could get the national governing body recognised back in 2007. So we had to actually come up with a formal definition, which had never really been done before. There were kind of informal definitions from the founders, and you could talk to them and have meetings, chats with them at training sessions or whatever. But there was nothing like, this is what parkour is, put out in a formal sense. So we sort of had to do that. So we've gone through that process of defining it formally, which obviously has potholes and
Yeah.
there's problems about doing that. But then we've also got the second question you asked, which is what's the meaningful? How do we think of it meaningfully to us as practitioners individually? And everyone's going to have a slightly different take on that. So they're sort of different questions. Like the formal definition of parkour is pretty good now, and it's pretty established worldwide, pretty much. And most of them have just taken from the one we first created for Parkour UK and for Sport England, and that's kind of popularized around the world. So most of them are related to that in some way, and it's pretty effective. It's pretty descriptive, let's put it that way. But it obviously doesn't capture any of the depth of the practice, not really, because you can't really capture it in Kierkegaard said, I think it was Kierkegaard said, if you label me, you negate me. So, I was very aware of that when we were creating that. I was like, well, the more we label this, guys, the more
Yeah.
we're going to actually negate what it is and miss it. So we had to be pretty careful with our definition in that way and keep it relatively broad, so that it didn't become interpreted too narrowly, which would lead it down the path of becoming something like gymnastics, etc., which is what happened to gymnastics. So
Yes.
it's a long way of saying it's difficult to define. but in the short answer is that parkour is a movement practice. It's a practice of self-knowledge and self-improvement through problem solving with movement in your environment, whatever environment that is. So that at the end, the founders used to say, when I trained with those guys back in France, they would just say it's running, jumping, climbing. They were very simplistic about it and say it's just running, jumping, and climbing. And on a basic level, yes, that is what it is. It's a combination of those things. But obviously, if you spoke to them deeper about it, they'd say, well, okay, let's get into it. Let's get into what it is and what it means to us. And it would go very, very profound.
Very much the Bruce Lee punch is just a punch, kick is just a kick. But,
Exactly.
There's a lot of complexity within that.
Yes.
I liked what you said about problem solving with movement, because that's a lot of what we try to do as well. A lot of the way our classes work is, we present people with a problem in the environment, and we ask how they would solve it. And I think I know you have a teaching background as well, so a lot of the student-centered teaching techniques would use that perspective. A lot of ecological dynamics, constraints-led approach would probably have a similar approach in the same way. It's like, we're going to present you with a problem. Can you solve it? And I think that resonates with a lot of people, which, ties into my follow-up question is, in some ways, parkour has an image problem. And what I mean is, a lot of what we do would fall under that definition of parkour, so I've said it before, but in some ways, everything is parkour. But that being said, I think people have a real expectation of what parkour is. There's a sort of public understanding, or there's an issue with the narrative of what parkour is that I sometimes think can act as a barrier to people engaging with it. I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and it's there's two sides to it, right? So yes, parkour has I don't know if it has an image problem, but it has a specific image in terms of
Yeah.
most people. If you say parkour, they'll be like, oh, the building jumping stuff,
Yes, exactly.
So their mind goes to that, and it goes to sort of crazy risk taking and adrenaline, their idea of this adrenaline fueled sports and that sort of stuff. And they think, okay, it's that's not for me. I don't do that. So there's that's kind of, I suppose, a negative element to it if you want to popularize something. Well, if you want people to practice it, it's actually very good at popularizing it because now everyone knows what it is. But if
Yes.
you want people to practice it, it's probably going to create a barrier to entry. However, the other side to that is by having a specific name and a definite sort of brand, sort of identity, that also draws in some people to train. So, for example, the way I look at it is, if you look at recent fitness modalities like CrossFit, F45, all these kind of these big training brands, right? The content of what they do is effectively just repurposing existing standard fitness and strength and conditioning drills in a various way, maybe in a certain pattern within a class, giving it a name like a WOD, and creating jargon and identity and culture. They create a brand, right? They create a brand. So, and that actually gets people to train in it, because if you said to someone, look, do you want to come down to the gym and throw some kettlebells around randomly and then do some sprinting, then do some running and then go back to doing some throwing some kettlebells around, they'll probably be like, nah, I'm all right. But if you say, do you want to come and train CrossFit? They'll be like, yeah, okay. Because it sounds interesting, cool, right? It sounds like a brand. It sounds cool. So parkour is kind of the same. If you said to people, do you want to go outside and just jump around and climb some buildings and that, people would be like, well, no, not really. But if you say, do you want to go out and do parkour? People are like, yeah, I want to do that, because the people that are, because it has an identity, it has a package, and this is the human condition. We work like that, right? So the content itself, yes, can be very broad, but the name has helped it become very popular very fast, but it has also created a barrier to entry in terms of how it's viewed because of the high level. It's ironic, parkour works so effectively at making you strong and fit and fast that it has made its athletic community, its community, so high level that then turns people off from training in it, because they go, well, look at those people, look how crazy they are, I could never do that. But it's the other way around. It's like, no, the only reason they can do that is because they train like this. So if you trained like this, you would be able to do that. Like that is, it is, as you say, it's chicken and egg, it's cart before the horse. It's not that those people can do that. It's not that those people are like that and therefore they can do parkour. It's those people trained parkour and therefore they can do that. So that's our kind of education piece, is helping people to understand, look, that high level stuff, yes, is the elite end of the sport. And just like any sport or physical practice, the elite end, you're not going to start there. And you may never get there. If you play rugby on a Sunday, you're probably never going to play in the Premiership or play for your country. But that doesn't mean you can't play rugby. And playing rugby will make you tough and resilient and fast and athletic and all that sort of stuff. So it's just about getting people to understand that it is a process and a protocol and a method of training. And this is why the using a specific brand name for calling something parkour and having a name is useful, because it helps people understand, if it's conveyed properly, it helps people understand that, okay, this is actually a discipline. There is a method to this. There are specific ways you train it. And that's why when some people say, well, everything is parkour, if you said that to the old parkour practitioners, they'd sort of be like, well, yes and no. Like anything could be parkour, but it doesn't necessarily mean just because you do anything, you're doing parkour. It is a very specific training protocol and a very specific approach to a way of thinking and a way of living and a way of understanding your environment. And it does have specific development pathways and kind of protocols of movement that you will go through, and psychological development processes. So it is quite specific. But it's about conveying that and packaging that and helping people understand it, really. Yeah.
That's good. I've just taken a bunch of notes on that, so I'll sort of unpack as we go. You said a lot of interesting things. One of the things you said earlier, you were just talking about the danger of, or the potholes in systematizing things, and that's one of the things I found as well. It's always interesting when you try to turn something, especially into an educational package, and I use the word package broadly. I don't even mean
Mm.
specifically a product, but whenever you try to take something that's quite nebulous and qualitative, and you try to turn it into something that can be communicated and transmitted to other people, obviously you end up losing a lot of the tacit information that's embedded in the learning process of that. And it's one of the things that I think is always interesting across the board with, obviously we see the same issue in martial arts. And again, the why of certain martial arts, and what is the point of certain martial arts, whether it's Brazilian jiu-jitsu or MMA versus Aikido, um, and things like that. But what I really want to hone in on, that I thought was interesting, is you mentioned F45, and I think High Rocks is the big one now, and then
Mm.
in CrossFit as well. And it's really interesting as someone who's a former CrossFit coach. I think that there was a lot of promise in CrossFit in the early 2000s, but uh, maybe in some ways the view was myopic because it's always based, as you said, in performing gym activities. There's always this level of abstraction in CrossFit where I think sometimes instead of getting people out and doing things, you say, well, what if, the thought was, what if we could do gym movements really, really quickly? Would that lead to a kind of athleticism? And I think, across the board in gyms and any kind of gym setting, we see this sort of de-skilling, this decoupling
Mm.
between physicality and actually being able to do things. And I remember, one of my favorite blogs that you've written is, you talk about this concept of practical movement versus functional movement. I don't know if you remember that piece.
Mm. Yeah, yeah.
I was wondering if you could expand on that a bit.
Well, the term functional movement or functional fitness and functional training, it became a buzzword however long, 10 years ago, maybe a little bit longer.
Maybe a little
Um,
longer now, yeah.
yeah, and it was just it's one of those weird buzzwords in the fitness industry that was seized upon and then just applied kind of randomly and it became meaningless pretty quickly, and to just mean anything that was outside of the normal gym training was now suddenly functional training, or anything that was weird and complex just for the sake of being complex, was functional training. But so it's a bit weird because you've got to first you have to go into what do you mean by what's functional, what do you mean by functionality, and most things when they're training functional training, what they're trying to do is work on a function of the human body, rather than the function of the human body. So all physical training is functional in some regard, right? A bicep curl is functional because it's working on the function of the arm and the bicep and the elbow joint,
Hmm.
which is to flex and extend, right? So you are working on a function of the body, but I wouldn't say it's kind of functional training because it's not working on the function of the human body, which is to move over terrain. It's not the same as the purpose. Some people are going to go, no, the function of the human body is to procreate. No, that's the purpose of the human body. That's different. Um, the function of the body and the brain, and the brain most importantly, because the brain is solely designed to manage movement. So the function of the brain and the body is to move over variable terrain. That's it, and to adapt to your environment in that way. So, in order to do truly functional training, you must do that because that's the function of the human body. So, if you're not getting better at moving in your environment, you're not doing functional training. It doesn't matter how complex it looks, whether you're standing on a wobble board and juggling chainsaws with your eyes closed. It's like it doesn't matter. That's not the function of the human body. It's not functional training. So I prefer to say, well, let's just put aside the word functional and use the word practical movement training, which is just simpler to understand. Okay, this is movement that is practical, as in it helps you do stuff in your environment. So sometimes we might call it situational movement training. And I think that's a better term to use than functional training because the word functional is so misused. So,
Yeah.
but a lot of it comes down to just how we're using the brain, right? And the brain, it's the back of the brain, it's the old parts of the brain that govern movement. It's not the prefrontal cortex. And if you want to become a good mover, and this is why parkour creates such good athletes, is because you must take the point of focus must be outside the body, outside what you're actually doing with your body, It must be outside of trying to control the movements. You must be focusing on an external task, and your body must adapt reflexively and unconsciously to that task to solve that problem. And in so doing, you will create good automatic movement patterns in the same way as driving a car. You don't look at the steering wheel and the pedals when you drive. You just look out where you're going, and your body will do what it needs to do to get the car there. That's what parkour is. That's why parkour works. There's no magic to it. It's simply that all parkour training is, there's an external task, which is jump across this or climb that or do this. And your body has to find a way to do that in a very holistic sense. It must solve the whole problem. And you can't think about flexing glutes or tightening your core and all this bullshit. I hate that sort of word.
Yeah.
You use your core and stuff like that. It's like, what does that? It means absolutely nothing. No one knows how to do that. So, it just you've got to apply your movement to an external task, and suddenly you will see good movement come out. Everyone is a good mover if the brain is allowed to, if the right part of the brain is allowed to take over, as in if you surrender control from the conscious part of the brain. So people say, I'm not a good mover, I'm a good mover. It's not true. Everyone has the same capacity for movement. It's just that they're either controlling their movement or not. They're trying to control it or not. They're a control freak or not, basically.
Yeah.
And so you have to strip that back if it's been overly controlled from a young age, or you haven't allowed them to find their limits as a mover when they're young, because that's the easiest way to do it, right? Is not to impose limits on the young and just let them go, let them do, let them play, let them be chaotic, let them explore chaos. That will create good movers. So a lot of it is just down to that. And the problem with gym training is that it's the opposite of that. Gym training is not looking to do a practical task. It's looking to do a very internal movement and control it as much as possible, such as a hinge or a flexion or a deadlift. Even the compound lifts, they're only collections of very isolated, specific movements done in a certain order. So because it's focusing so much on those things, it's not focusing on an external task such as climb the building. So it doesn't really create much variable adaptive movement patterns. It doesn't automate. It doesn't create the automated patterns, the automated ability to solve variable problems. So you won't be as adaptive when new challenges come your way. You'll be very good at the things you train, such as deadlifting, but you won't be good at anything else.
Yeah.
So it's a question of what do you want to be good at? If deadlifting is your practice and you want to be a good deadlifter, great. I mean, then you should 100% just do that. But if you're deadlifting in order to be good at rugby, don't think it's going to make you a good rugby player, because it's not.
Yeah. I've been trying to play with that dichotomy. So I've started using practical as well for the same reasons that you have. And I try to draw the distinction between practical and what I've been calling arbitrary movement, and not arbitrary as in random, but arbitrary as in there's a certain amount of arbitration. There has to be some external judge to say, did you get the rep, yes or no? How many points did you get on that gymnastics set?
Yes.
Because ultimately, other fitness modalities can say, oh, well, we're doing functional movement and we're doing this. It's like, yeah, but if there's someone standing there saying rep or no rep, based on some predetermined points of performance that don't take anything else into the count other than the aesthetic quality of that movement done with that specific implement. To me, I think a lot of people have sort of been kidding themselves on that.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's the other word that we started using, or I started using, I guess, very early on in parkour, was task-oriented training.
Yes.
And that, what you described there, is not task-oriented training. That's
exactly.
That's rules-based training.
Yes.
So where you've got rules that you have to, arbitrary rules, as you say, that you have to conform to, like you must do the movement in this way in order to get the point. But when you ask them, well, why do I have to do it in that way? They'll say, well, because of this and this and this. But the reality is like, well, yeah, but why? If I can lift the weight and get it above my head, why do I have to do it that way? Like, those rules were created. Those rules were refined and created through the need to measure for competition.
Exactly.
That's how gymnastics became gymnastics. If you want to measure if you want to compete in something, you have to be able to measure it. And in order to measure it, you must therefore standardize it. And the standardization becomes, the godlike, this is the way it must be done. And parkour has never had that. until fairly recently competitions have appeared, but they're doing mostly a good job of sort of keeping the parkour ethic in there. But because parkour didn't care about that at all, it cared solely about task-oriented training, which is, can we climb this building? How you get up there, how it looks while you're doing it, no one cares. No one cares. It's like, can you get up there? Can you jump across this gap? No one cares how you do it. Can you do it safely and get up well on the other side and keep training? So it's the task you're focused on now. The outcome, again, your focus has gone external to your body, and that makes all of the difference. I mean, it's not a small point. This is the thing. It's not an insignificant point. This is a critical point in movement practice. And you can almost divide movement practices between things that do that and things that don't do that, and you will see a difference in the practitioners.
Yeah, that's good. I've been thinking a lot about education recently, and I've been reading a lot of John Holt, who's one of those old sort of theorists from the 1970s that are really interesting, because the way people used to talk about things in the 1970s, you get this glimpse of like final ways that people used to make sense of the world before computers came in. And then you really see a difference in the quality of writing. But he has this line that I always mangle, and he says, um, if someone decided to call themselves a walking teacher, then parents would pay thousands of dollars to have the walking teacher come teach the children how to walk correctly, and then no one would ever learn how to walk.
Yes.
And it's one of the things I see over and over and over again in the fitness industry. And actually, I had an interesting experience today. Saying I've had some back pain, and just sort of because I want to give myself permission to move and use my back, just to make sure that I hadn't done something catastrophically wrong to it, even though I don't really think I did. I went to go see a physio at a practice I don't think I'll go back to. And it was interesting because the whole experience was so disempowering. The moment I went in and sort of went in as a client, or went in as a patient, or whatever they want to think, right away I felt like they weren't actually listening to what I was saying. I could tell that the physio sort of had this checklist. It's like, oh, what's that? Oh, you've got anterior pelvic tilt. Oh, you must sit a lot. You must use computers a lot. That's probably what's causing your back pain. And none of it was relevant to at hand. I was just trying to see, like, is this serious, or is this something that I can just move over the next few days? And they started doing manual adjustments on me, which I wasn't interested in at all. And then they gave me some very basic remedial movements, which I found on YouTube earlier anyway. So I was looking at the whole thing, but then at the end they're like, okay, well, I want you to come back in 2 days, and I'll do some more massages, and I'll give you some more things, and we'll get you better. And I was thinking, actually, like, nothing about this experience did you convince me that you being here is going to have anything to do with my recovery, actually.
Right. Yep.
And I was thinking that so much, and I want to talk about the fitness industry as well. So much of the fitness industry, and we don't need to talk about medicine, because that's a different kettle of fish. But you realize that it sort of disempowers people, because you have someone who's in the role of the personal trainer or the expert, or in this case, the physio. I'm not knocking physiotherapy. I just didn't have a great experience. And it's one of the things I think about. You see people all the time, they go into gyms, and the personal trainer will say, "Oh, well, you're doing this wrong. You're moving wrong. You're doing that wrong. The way you do this movement is going to hurt you." And I've seen so many people who come from these sort of gym backgrounds, and they end up being afraid to do anything. They end up being afraid to express any sort of power or explosivity, or to like really use their body in a way to get anything done. And I guess that's my way of, we sort of danced around the topic, but as someone who used to have one foot in the fitness industry, and I would say has left to a certain degree, I don't want to get you in trouble, but it seems to me that there are a lot of things the fitness industry as a whole could do better. And I think we've sort of had about 40 years to see what the current models are capable of. And it doesn't seem to me that on a population level, things are moving in the right direction. So without getting you in trouble, all right?
You're not
What?
You're not going to give me trouble. I've been saying that exact thing to the
All
fitness
right.
industry since I've been in the fitness industry.
Okay, because just yeah, well, could you kind of expand on that then? Like on the failures that you've seen, and sort of the missed opportunities that we've had in the last 40 years, but then also what can we do to get things moving in the other direction? How can we actually, and not even the fitness industry, how can we affect positive change?
Yeah, I mean, so, there's so much in there, right? But firstly, my introduction to the fitness industry, I had nothing to do with the fitness industry initially, right? I trained in martial arts and practical skills and survival skills, and then I started training in parkour, and that there was, we never trained in gyms. We had nothing to do with gyms or fitness people or any of that sort of stuff. And then we were invited into the fitness industry to go to one of the big American fitness events and go and teach parkour, and go and show them what we were doing. Basically, because the fitness industry started to see parkour athletes and go, well, how do these guys get so fit and strong and fast? So they literally said, how do you do that? How do you guys train? And we said, oh, well, we'll show you. So we went along to their events, but so my first introduction to the fitness industry was seeing a very high level of the fitness industry, the big fitness events in the States, and IDEA and URSA and all that lot.
Hmm.
And uh, and I distinctly remember walking around and meeting all the different fitness groups, and and thinking, my God, this is a load of rubbish. Like this is all bullshit. All of it.
Yep.
Like,
Yep.
no, not all of it. There's some that are very, very good and knew their stuff. But it's Pareto's principle, right? 80-20.
Yes. Yes.
20% are good. And same with physios, same with personal
And
trainers. 20% are awesome, 80% are very average.
yep.
So, but my view of the fitness industry there was like, okay, most of this is absolute rubbish in terms of movement and health and fitness and strength or whatever. So, we just basically said, guys, you don't need to be doing 80% of this. You just need to be focusing on this. The old stuff was the best, right? The old athletic stuff and
Hmm.
physical play and games and fighting and, running, jumping, climbing, all this stuff.
Yep.
The old stuff, we just need to do more of that, and give that, put some interesting pathways to maybe keep people interested in developing it. But basically, most of the stuff you're doing is a waste of time. And after I've been in the fitness industry for a while, I realized like, oh, they know that too.
Yep.
The fitness industry people know that. They know they're just trying to sell products each year. So they know that they have to create something new to sell a new product to the fitness world. So that's the fitness industry in and of itself. Whether it does any good or not is an interesting question, because it didn't exist pre 1960s, 70s, 50s, 60s, 70s. There was no fitness industry really, right? There was sports, and then there was sort of conditioning for sports came in with the Russians as they started to get into that, Verkhoshansky and plyometrics, and that they started to get into that. But pretty much before the middle of the 20th century, there was no such thing as the fitness industry. And yet the population of the world was clearly healthier and fitter and stronger on average than it is now. So you could argue that the fitness industry has zero effect on the fitness of the world. You probably quite convincingly could argue that. It doesn't mean it's all a waste of time. It doesn't mean it's all rubbish. A lot of people do it very well. A lot of people, it's their practice, it's their life, it's their way of life. Great, awesome. A lot of people get a huge amount of benefit from going to these classes and training like this. It makes them feel great, whatever. So they should do it. But you could really go deep into the question of, if you remove the fitness industry from society, would it make any difference to the overall health of society? And
Yeah, I mean, I could see someone playing devil's advocate and see maybe perhaps the opportunity cost, or what did Illich call it? Illich used to call it a radical monopoly, where the existence of a technology or the existence of an organization it negates other options. So,
yeah,
for example, when you start designing cities around cars, all of a sudden you lose walkable cities.
absolutely.
If you have the space of the fitness industry, which is a professionalized, commodified, um, and I would argue, yeah, I mean, like you said, the fitness industry is interesting because they make money off of the final clients, but then also you have that level of client, which are the trainers themselves, who are caught in this hamster wheel of constant certifications, always need to
Mhm.
buy the fancy new things, always need to get like whatever the gadgets are for this year, and to me, I would guess that a large plurality of the industry itself is making money off of people who would like to become trainers one day. And then, the rest of it is, is large gyms plus whatever distribution, Pareto distribution we want to see of different other businesses. But I mean, I could see a good argument where, it's sort of like, I used this example in a podcast earlier, but I remember there was this article going around a few years ago by an economist saying, we don't need libraries because we have Starbucks and we have Amazon now, you know, and completely ignoring all the assets, that a local library brings in terms of a
Mm.
place where people can come for free and congregate
Yeah.
and share conversations and meet and not have it be a transaction. And I think, if you go to certain Northern European countries, they still have gyms, but they also have various leisure centers and public pools. And it's a different culture, it's a different political background, I understand. Um, but you see, there's less emphasis in some ways on certain kinds of gym culture because people can just sort of meet and be and move around in other contexts. But I cut you off. You're gonna give the big solution for everything.
Right, no, no, definitely not. But I mean, yes, it's exactly that, right? The minute you start to create this notion of gyms and fitness industry and fitness classes, you then sort of depower everything else and you create this mindset of, well, we have to go, if you want to be fit, you have to do that. Whereas before that existed, people just were active. They were physically active. They played sports. They went for walks. They climbed hills and mountains. They whatever. They went for their morning constitutionals. They did. They were physically active without thinking it's separate from my life. It's just part of life. But now the gym, people, most people think, oh, the gym is like, I have to go to the gym to work out. There's a small percentage of people that go because it's their place. They love, as you say, they love going. It's their community. They feel great there. They become addicted to that, and that's a small percentage of people. The vast majority of people see the gym as work. They see it as
Yep.
a chore. They see it as something that's not part of their life. They see it as something they have to do in order to mitigate all the bad shit about living in the modern world. And
Hmm.
I must go to be a good person, so
Yes.
I can eat my burger tomorrow night. I must go and
Yes.
run. So they see it as something outside of their life. So, and that's not the way gym owners, I think, or I hope, want people to be. You don't want them to come, because they think they have to. You want to come because it's a great place to be and training's awesome, and you can meet great people, and it's an outlet in an urban world. It's a place where you can go and just be physical. So I think movement spaces or gyms should become more movement based and should go back to that old idea of the gymnasium, of like a space where you go and you just explore your physicality and your movement without too many rules. It doesn't mean you can't work on technique. It doesn't mean, so the constraints led model and the ecological dynamics, things like this, they are awesome, especially for younger people, especially for kids. But there's no doubt that the cognitive methods of skill acquisition create elite performers, right? So parkour, if you look at parkour, a lot of people say, well, it's constraints led method of movement, and it has elements of that, but it's not just that. Parkour, like any other discipline, has an element of that, certainly at the beginning. But if you want to get really good at parkour, if you really want to push your movement limits, you will need to move into the cognitive skill acquisition model. And everyone does. All parkour practitioners do. They don't just go out and play around.
Yep.
Definitely not. They do play, but they play with a real focus. So they will find it eventually. They'll go and explore, find a jump that's a good challenge, and then they will drill that jump repeatedly until they get it right. They will change slight details, change their run up, change this, change that, work on their technique, build the strength for the landing until eventually one day they can do that jump and tick off that challenge. That is a very cognitive model of skill acquisition. They're absolutely specifically trying to improve a skill to solve a certain problem. So to say that parkour is just constraints-led model of movement, so in the parkour coaching world, it went around about 5-6 years ago. Everyone was
Yeah.
all the coaches were going, yeah,
Yeah.
just ranting about that because they found out
Yeah.
about it. But it's like, well, yes, guys, it's good that you've discovered that. But no, parkour is
Yeah.
both. So I prefer this. I sort of think of the best, not the best, but a good way to train is to have a constrained cognitive model, which is, you do need the constraints led stuff, certainly at the beginning as you're exploring your movement and when you're young. But as you get better in the skill and or older, you are going to move more towards the cognitive method in order to really push your potential and find out, if you want to find real elite performance in movement, you're going to need to do that because all elite performers in all disciplines do that.
Yeah.
um
It's interesting because you see it sort of go through. I remember Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it started to become really big in the last few years as well. And it's like with any of these models, there's sort of like the hard and soft version of it, where, some people want to apply it to everything, where obviously I think, and I think if you talk to most people writing in the space at the academic level, I think they'd admit that there's a certain continuum there between like, emergent versus prescriptive coaching styles, and like how you lead somebody
Mhm.
towards certain movement solutions. Like you're not going to randomly find the optimal solution for everything. And like the role of a coach is certainly to draw people's attention to better ways of doing things. And it's always funny because I think even like someone like Rob Gray, he'll say all the time, he's like, there's there's no rule that you can't cue people or you can't show people how to do something. Because if you just treat them like a rubber ball bouncing around, hoping that they'll finally find the optimal solution to something, then that's obviously not,
Exactly right.
it's not going to fly. And as with all things, people get a good idea, um, and then certain people want to proselytize with it. And I think it is a fantastic tool. And so many of the people that we use are some of the people that we work with, because they have so little movement background. I think it can be very liberating. But then what I often find, and is also talked about in the space, is it doesn't have a lot of face validity. The other side of that is people want to be shown how to do things. If you come in and say, I'm just going to facilitate this environment for you to explore and find movement solutions, that's going to be too woolly for most people. Most
Mhm.
people, they enjoy the process of having, a teacher or a sensei or whatever. I think, yeah, Rob Gray on one of his recent podcasts, he was talking about this martial arts paper I thought was really interesting, where essentially he was teaching knife defense to police officers, and they did a sort of test retest. And what they found is at the end of it, using the ecological approach for knife defense actually ended up having better long lasting benefits, on knife defense than teaching prescribed techniques. But the problem is that none of the police officers valued that training because they wanted to be shown certain
Mhm.
techniques. And I don't think that we should dismiss that. I think that the process of formally teaching people is very beneficial and giving them structure. And it's definitely something that should be done on a continuum. I'm always very wary whenever somebody says this is the only way to do it, when in fact that's a useful tool and that's a useful tool. And I'm sure we can probably find a way to fit them together.
Yeah, and and that's the redemption for gyms and personal trainers, right?
Mm,
Is that a good personal trainer will do the same thing. They won't have someone come in and say, "Oh, you're moving wrong. You're doing this wrong."
yeah.
They will look at them and say, "Okay, this is how you move. This is where your body is at the moment. This is where your strengths and weaknesses are, and this is maybe why you're feeling pain here. And let's look at optimizing what you're doing so that you get fitter and stronger and healthier and live with less pain." So it's not about like saying you're doing it wrong. It's just about saying this is where you are now, and there are probably reasons for you being there now because of lifestyle, etc., or prior injury or whatever. Um, and what can we do to make you stronger and better? So a good PT, and I know many good PTs. My partner is an amazing personal trainer, and they change lives in a very beneficial way, a very positive way, because they're effectively healthcare professionals. That most of their work is people come to them and say, I've got an injury, or I've got a problem, or I feel pain, and I don't want to be in pain. They're kind of healthcare professionals, really.
Yeah.
It's very rare that someone comes and says, I just want to improve my performance. Most clients are people that have an injury or pain, and they want a solution. And a good PT will give that. They will say, well,
Yes.
let's look at what's suboptimal here, and let's try and improve it. Let's try and strengthen what's weak, and look at the imbalances, and you know. But that's the 20%, right? That's a small group of
Yes.
PTs, because you have to have really good knowledge to do that. That isn't, you can't just do that with random constraints led models. You have to really know the body and go, okay, this is actually
Yes.
how the body works, and this is the reason why that pain exists. And this prescribed thing that I'm going to teach you to do will probably fix it. So there's nothing wrong with PT stuff, and gyms can be hugely effective, and teaching can be hugely, of course, it can be hugely effective. Look at the human history. Um, so to throw it all out would be insane.
Yeah.
Um, but equally, yes, the idea of the purely didactic model of there is only one way and you must follow this way and is also problematic. So it's always about a balance and what each individual needs. Some individuals will come to us in movement terms and they'll be very strong maybe, maybe they're a gym person, they're very strong, but they've got no movement intelligence, right? Their physical
Mm.
literacy is very low, no adaptability. So for them, we will give them a more constraints led model. We'll probably say, look, we're just going to try and loosen you up a bit and get you to play more and get you to adapt more and get your body to relax and just, as you say, just find your potential without having to follow these patterns of movement. Let's just move and have fun. And that will be the balance to what they need. But then we'll get other people who come in who are totally detrained, who they're almost too mobile and too loose.
Mm.
And for them, we'll say, look, we need to work on your strength, we need to work on your landing technique, we need to work on this, because those things will correct your lack of structure. So it's always about what's the balance. It's always about a balance. What does that person need to balance out what they are?
Yeah, I've seen this trend a lot where it's all well and good to tell people just to improvise and move. In fact, I was talking about this in a podcast earlier today, but you do need to give people sometimes a foundation so they can express themselves. Exactly like you said, if people don't have sort of the structural foundations in order to be able to support their body and move their body in, or just the stability, whatever, it's not really fair to say, hey, go out and try this and see what happens, because they haven't had the benefit of spending the last however many years of their life sort of developing their core abilities. I I'm mindful of your time, and there's a question I want to come in. It's something you've touched on a little bit. You've used the word community a lot, and it's one of the things that we really it's one of the things that we really try to push is how can you sort of build a community and a sustainable community, meaning one that people can stay, something they can gravitate around. When I say sustainable, I also mean something where if the coach were to disappear or if the gym were to close up or something like that, could you build something where just the clients, the members, would be able to keep on practicing in some way or another on their own if say the gym shut down, if the coach decided to move to a different country. And I don't need you to focus on that, but I would like you to kind of talk a little bit about your experience in building communities, and sort of what it takes to make a healthy, I don't know, let's call it a healthy active community, something that can sustain over a long time and can build friendships and also just help build people outside of their physical capabilities.
Yes, I mean that's one thing that you can look at. Disciplines like CrossFit and and
Hmm.
and gym industry in general, and say they do that very well. They're very good at building communities, and building a culture that people want to be part of, and that is very that's very useful and can be very useful, can be very important. Now, I guess the first question you'd have to address is when you're talking about this sort of thing is, firstly, is this the community I'm trying to build, is it good for people, right? Because you can build communities that are not good for people. Look at cults, right?
Hmm.
So
Yes.
Waco, for example, that that cult that happened back then.
Yeah.
David Koresh and that lot. That's a
Yeah.
community. It's a very strong community, but it's not. Most people would say it's not a healthy community, right? So
Hmm.
you can build communities that are very unhealthy, and you can build communities that are very good for the individual. And we want to build communities that are good. So most communities are built on shared values. So it comes down to, if you've got strong values, you will a core group of people at the center of the community have, and they share with each other. That will attract other people who want to live by those values, or want to, they see them, they need those values in their lives. They will come, or they see that they have those values and therefore it relates to them. They will come and they will start to glue around this core group, and you'll build up this community that will self-select. That's how most communities build, right? Because people that don't have those values will be like, well, that's not me. So CrossFit is, for example, is based on the values that CrossFit has at its core are consistency, hard work, um, but fun as well. Having
Yeah.
fun with a group, and doing more than just go to the gym. They drink beer, they go
Yeah.
out, for have burgers or whatever. So, but it's very much about hard work, consistency. Maybe too much hard work in the early years with
Yeah.
rhabdo and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But those values are very strong, and that drew people in that have those values. And people that don't have those values would be like, yeah, that's not me, I'm not going to go there. So it's self-select, and it worked very well. So if you want to build a community, the key is you must first of all have very strong values that you believe in, or whether you believe in them or not. You've got to espouse them, and you've got to stick to them, so that people will be drawn in who want those values, and then it will just build and build and build and build and build. And as long as the core keep that's what will keep it alive. So the parkour community, which when I started parkour, was very small, but it was very strong. It was very small. There were very few people in the world that knew it or did it, but that meant, and it was very extreme in a way in its training, and that meant that everyone that was drawn to it was equally extreme. So, and it was very, very self-select. It had a huge selection, sort of a hugely strong and effective selection barrier, right? It was like a filter. If you weren't, maybe slightly crazy, if you weren't incredibly driven to do it, incredibly passionate about it, so much so that you would go and hunt down the few practitioners in France who did it.
Yeah.
If you weren't that crazy, you were not going to learn it. So it basically meant that the small group of practitioners who got into it around the world were all very similar in their values. So you could go anywhere. You could travel to Australia, say, put on a forum, I'm coming to Perth. Are there anyone around? And someone would pop on a forum and go, yeah, come and train with me. You go and train with them, and within 2 minutes, you'd be best friends.
Yeah.
You would know that they had very similar values to you. They would be all about challenge. They would be all about effort, culture of effort. They'd be all about, freedom and thinking beyond kind of the fixed parameters. But they'd be very disciplined individuals, and they'd be super friendly and super humble. And they were all like that everywhere in the world you went. It was really weird, right? So, but you 100% knew they would be like that. So that was the core of the community. As the community grew, it attracted more and more people like that. So the early years of the community was very, very much like that. And then it grew and grew and grew and grew and grew. And as it grows, it begins to evolve and dilute, and you get offshoots, and it begins to change a bit, right? It's the same as happened in the martial arts, same happened in CrossFit, same happened in everything. So, but the community was the key point that I took away from that was, okay, this community is built on values, shared values. They're not written down. It's not like a Bible or anything like that, or a dogma in that way. But the values in parkour are very strong. And what was interesting to me at the time in parkour is that those values, again, they weren't taught verbally, or no one there was no teacher out there, or guru saying you must be like this. Everyone automatically had that, and that I believe is because the training was so difficult that it automatically created or brought about those understandings in people. Like, you couldn't be arrogant in parkour.
Yeah. You also can't fake it in parkour.
You can't fake it. You can't be arrogant. You have to be strong and resilient, because it's going to be really hard work. You have to kind of develop courage. So otherwise you just couldn't train it back then. So it would draw those things out of you, and that's why everyone was so humble, because you couldn't be arrogant, because you knew how difficult it was. So it kind of made you humble. It humbled you in a really good way. So and I think that was fantastic. So I think in terms of building communities, it's very much about knowing what your values are, and then being very strong on them and sharing them and saying, these are the values that we live by. And that's what all communities are built, right? Religions and whatever. I mean, they all build around that. So you've got to stick to them, though, and you've got to walk your talk. That's the key thing. If you want the community to grow and last, you've got to create, not legends, but you've got to create stuff in it where people can go, those people they walk their talk.
But there is a bit of a legend, like the definition of a tribe is often having a shared mythology, or just in general, like, I think having a founding legend, I think is important. It's how these sort of, imagined communities just sort of emerge and maintain over time. So, maybe it's not a legend now, but another generation or two, maybe.
Stories. I mean, it's stories, right?
Stories,
It's as you say, myths or fables or foundational stories. It's a narrative.
Foundational stories.
It's a narrative. That's what it's got to have. And
yes,
because then as time goes on, people in the future will be able to look back and go,
exactly,
remember that guy, and they will grow into legends, and it happens in martial arts, right? The founder, the guy who created X view of karate 200 years ago becomes like a legend and a godlike figure, and everyone talks about, this guy could catch bullets with his teeth or whatever. Obviously rubbish, but everyone you sort of believe that if you're following that style of karate, you're encouraged to believe that. and everyone sort of wants to believe it. So the narrative grows up, and that creates that style, that school. It's built around stories. It's just like religion. So,
Yeah.
but sports are the same. You know, you have great players of the past you always think back to, and they become your idols and your icons, and you always go, if you want to be like this guy, you've got to play like, you know, you've got to train this hard or whatever. So in a way, yeah, legendary figures come out of it naturally. But I
Yeah.
guess it's foundational stories. But the stories are based on, what are the values that person lived by, that we can also kind of live by. You know, we can sort of connect to that story by living through the same values. So I think the values thing is hugely important.
No, that makes a lot of sense. For people who would like to start engaging with parkour in some way, and obviously, you know, a lot of ways parkour blew up with the internet. But if people are living in rural communities, so not living in cities that might actually have a dedicated parkour group, especially people living rurally who might not even feel like they have a city that they can interact with. How can people start to practice parkour in some capacity?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a question we've been asked since the beginning, because in the early days the communities were very fragmented and very small and very few. So, you know, most people didn't have access to a community of parkour practitioners. They would be the one person in their state or their city, or maybe their country, who wanted to do it. They were like, well, the only other guys I know who do it live 1,000 miles in that direction in another country. So they had to travel. So, and I'm quite old school in that I think, you know, if you're really into something, if you really want to learn something, you should be willing to pick up sticks and go to the place where the best teachers are and
Hmm.
learn from them. You know, this convenience culture that we have of like, oh, unless it's outside my door,
Yeah.
you know, it's like, well, if you think like that, then tough shit. I just
Yeah.
don't care. I'm not interested in you. You know,
Yeah.
you have to be willing to be like, the best guys teach and they live on another continent. So I'm going there. And you should travel there and learn from them. Now, with the internet and that, you don't actually need to do that now. It's to some degree you can access a lot of stuff online. So you certainly can start training if you live kind of in the middle of nowhere. You can, you know, tutorials on YouTube and protocols you can follow, and on online courses and things. You can certainly do that and go out and begin with those principles. The difficult thing is just filtering through all that information to get to like what's the good stuff, you
Yep.
know, and that's hard to do, unless that's why it's better to go and find people in person, and people who have some kind of um lineage, maybe in a similar way to the martial arts, like some people that have some connection to the root of the art, because they're probably going to be more likely to connect you to
Yep.
the things that made it that made it good, that made it strong, that made it popular. It doesn't mean that the offshoots aren't also interesting in their own way, but they're probably they're more likely to be, or they're less likely to be reliable,
Yeah.
because they haven't been around as long. They may disappear. They may just be a fad. They may be wrong in their teaching and their training. Whereas if you go to the older stuff that's lasted and is the stuff that made it popular, you're more likely to find something in there that's actually of value and of worth. So I'd say finding that root, finding that lineage, finding a group, you know, an organization or a teacher or a practitioner who can help you understand where it came from, I think is very important. And that's the main issue with the internet, is filtering that stuff, right?
Yeah.
But I'd say, you know, combination of the two. If you live in the middle of nowhere, then go online and start doing some research. But as soon as you can, get on a bus or a boat or a plane and go
Yeah.
somewhere where there are very experienced communities, and just train with them for a bit, for a week, 2 weeks, a month, and go, okay, this is what parkour is.
Yeah.
You know, it was the same for me when I started training. I was living in Japan, training in martial arts, because I wanted to train in a very specific sword art. So I had to go and live in Japan. So it was like, well, I need to go and live there. So I lived there for 5 years to train in that art, because there was only one school in the world. So while I was living there and training there, that was when I discovered parkour. But I discovered it, you know, remotely, because the only practitioners were in France and the UK at that stage. So I was like, okay. So I can't really. So I had to sort of start learning online. There was no YouTube back then. It was just like
Yeah.
streaming videos or whatever, or internet
It's funny
forums.
trying to explain that to people, that like there was
Yeah,
there
they're just
was
like,
no
what?
YouTube until, I don't know, whatever, 2006 or something.
Yeah, 2005 I think was when it started. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's so I started online with a friend out in Japan, two friends out in Japan, and we did start training and we started making some progress, right? But then it was only when I was back in Europe, and found the French guys and started training with them. That was like, oh, right,
Mm,
this is what it is. It was very. Then I said, right, okay, this is how you train it. It was very different from what I'd seen online. Um, Not different, but it was like, okay, the stuff online was just the icing on the cake.
yes.
The actual training is this, and that was not shown at all. And I was like, oh shit! So I completely changed my approach to it, and that was when I really understood what parkour was, by founding the people that trained in it. And it was their life. So I say you have to. I think if you're serious about something, you have to do that. And if you don't do that, it's okay, but it just means you're not serious about it. Like,
Yeah.
which is okay.
Yeah, that's that's fine too. Um, what are some projects that you're working on right now? Or what are some things you'd like to talk about?
I mean, we're always working on a lot of different things. So we're using parkour in many ways and across different industries, and to kind of connect with different walks of life, I suppose. But in particular, we're focusing quite a lot on kids at the moment, and because we began training adults for the first however many years of
Hmm.
Parkour Generations, we were not exclusively adults, but that's where we focused on adult training and adult athletic development. And then over the last sort of 10 years, we've developed a very robust program for kids and for schools and education in that way. And I'm very much focused on developing more kids academies. We have the London Parkour School, and we're looking for more to branch that out, because that's worked really well. And those kind of education programs for school teachers and development paths for kids, mainly because we see that it's fairly obvious that the way to have the biggest impact on the world is to help kids move better in terms of health, so that they grow up more physically literate, because then they're more likely to keep moving for their whole life, and therefore less likely to get all the things that kill you, the heart disease, the liver
Yes.
failure, all that sort of stuff, the obesity. So you have a bigger impact by getting them early, and kids are great. Most modern cultures, the kids are becoming less physically literate. So that's where we see the biggest impact that we can make, and the biggest difference we can make. So we're really, really focusing on the kids at the moment, and the kids programs, and those kind of development paths, and academies, kids academies, which are spaces in an urban setting, are spaces where the kids can go and be wild. They can be chaotic, again, it's still very structured training, but
Hmm.
we introduce them to chaos. We basically say, here's some problems, solve this. We're going to give you some tools, we're going to ask you to solve it. And then as they get older, they get more into the discipline. We go, right now we're going to go more into the cognitive model and teach you the skill at a really deeper level. And then they become, really good practitioners of parkour, really good athletes, very strong, capable, psychologically strong, courageous, brave, all that stuff. So that and for kids in an urban environment, that's very hard to access these days,
Yeah.
because the ideal is they should just be outside on the streets, playing around, climbing buildings, getting into trouble. That's the ideal for kids. Make no bones about it, that's the best way to develop physically literate kids. But if you can't do that, then the second best option is, right, let's create a space where we can sort of simulate that chaos a bit. And I use this term chaos quite a lot now with kids, in terms of we're looking to kind of build chaos in these kids, because order comes from chaos, right? You must have chaos in order for order to emerge. And I think the problem with a lot of kids these days, or not the problem with the kids, the problem with modern society, is it removes the chaos as soon as it can, and
Yes.
tries to impose order on absolutely everything the kid does. And
Yes.
that is not that is not the right way. That is not the way. The way is expose them to chaos, and just gradually expose them to more and more chaos, and give them the tools they need to manage the chaos, but don't take away the chaos. Like, they need that. So and modern society is definitely trying to remove the chaos, in some strange belief that that's safer and healthier, when it is definitely more dangerous and less healthy.
I feel like that could be a whole other podcast. You could talk about anti-fragility and
For
abundance and
sure.
all kinds of things. And maybe in a few months I could get you back on again. I know you have a lot of
That'd be awesome, man.
travel
Happy
ahead
to.
of you. That was great. I want to be respectful of your time, so I'm going to cut it off there because I thought that was a good place. to do. It was just, yeah, a really great conversation. I put you up on a pedestal, but I think you delivered. So
Yeah, no pedestals, man. But yeah, no, it's really good to chat. And what you guys are doing, with Wild Strong is awesome. I mean, yeah, you just need more ideas like that, more people thinking like that, and just out, a little bit outside the box, a little bit like how can we introduce some more chaos and some more problem
yeah,
solving, and yeah, I think that's really cool. So
yeah.
just keep doing what you're doing, man.
It seems to be legible now. I think a lot of these ideas were harder to articulate a few years ago, but something happened post COVID where I think people recognize the need of being outside and seeing people face to face. And yeah, we'll see where it goes.
For sure.
Day, night. It's a daily exercise. It's a daily exercise. It's a daily exercise.
Okay, so that was my conversation with Dan Edwards, Parkour Generations. We did mention a few articles, and I put them down in the show notes. So if you want to read his article on practical movement versus functional movement, that's in there. We have one of his articles on physical literacy, which is in there, and I've included a few other ones as well. So go ahead and check those out, and check out Dan at Parkour Generations. The other thing I want to say is he does have a new program out called Movement DNA, which I think is a really great synthesis of lots of different movement modalities. It's their attempt to kind of take different ideas on how to move and put them into sort of one cohesive and accessible system. So I would check that out. And, if you have any questions, once again, just send them over. We'll be happy to talk about it. And I've always found that Dan is quite generous with his time as well. So I'm sure if you email Parkour Generations, they'd be more than willing to chat with you about anything if you wanted to get involved with them. All right, take care.